Hi everyone, this is Shauna Tarosa, RAYAC's Executive Officer, and this is my desk. In this monthly video cast, we come over questions that are coming across my desk every single day, so we can have much smoother real estate transactions here in York and Adams counties. And guests of my podcast normally know that I typically like to say that I'm not an attorney and I do not play one on TV, but my favorite guest is with us today at my desk, RAYAC solicitor Peter Ruth, who is an attorney with Stock and Leader in downtown York.
Yes, good morning. Thanks for having me.
And Peter, we're so happy to have you because we have an important topic to talk about today.
We do, very important.
All right, we are going to talk about some big legislative changes in regards to wholesaling in Pennsylvania. So let's start off with the basics. Tell everybody, what is wholesaling?
That's a very good question. So I'll talk about the typical wholesaling transaction. So I think the easiest way to think about this is before a seller signs an agreement of sale with a buyer, that seller in typical transactions will hold what's called legal and equitable title. So they hold the legal title, which means they can sell it to whom they want, and they also will own the equitable title, meaning they have the right to possess it, to use it, and really the future right to sell it or to own it if they want to do that. Once a buyer comes into the picture and makes an offer with that seller and they sign an agreement of sale, that seller has effectively conveyed the equitable title, the future right to own it, provided they meet those contingencies, to that buyer. Okay, so legal title and equitable title have been severed. Where a wholesaler comes into play, and that's a typical transaction with a buyer and a seller, and then in a non-wholesale transaction, that buyer then shows up at a settlement table, sits across from the seller signs a deed over to them, as well as a settlement sheet and a bunch of other documents. The buyer pays the money to the seller, and the buyer gets the title to the property. In wholesaling, the difference is that when the buyer and the seller enter into that agreement, instead of the buyer having an intention to show up at settlement to acquire title, the legal title to the property, the buyer is saying, wait, I'm going to acquire that equitable interest with the intention of marketing it to someone else, another third party, what I call the end buyer, the buyer who will actually sit across the settlement table from the seller at closing, and they will try to market that equitable interest to the end buyer, and then the end buyer will end up buying that interest, oftentimes for a fee, and that middleman or that wholesaler then will be compensated somehow from that transaction. So very similar to a regular transaction, except that first buyer, that wholesaler, is not going to be the one sitting across the settlement table from the seller. It will be the end buyer. And you might ask, why would anybody do this? Because that wholesaler is collecting a fee. Now, either they're collecting the fee from the buyer directly, saying, hey, in addition to buying the property, you're going to pay me this amount. Or what typically happens is the buyer, that end buyer, has agreed to purchase the seller's property for an amount higher than the seller has agreed to accept from the wholesaler. So the wholesaler then will get that difference between those purchase prices. So you can tell this is a transaction where transparency may not always be there. I've been involved in transactions where sellers have sat down and said, wait, who's that person? I had an agreement with someone else and now they're buying the property. So I think wholesaling can be done well when disclosure is involved, and wholesaling can be done to the detriment of the consumer if those disclosures are not there. So that's what wholesaling is generally, but again, it can vary depending on the context.
Perfect. So as you alluded to, there's been a concern about there needs to be greater transparency surrounding the wholesale transactions. So this was a priority for the Pennsylvania Association of Realtors, is to provide more guidance and transparency in that wholesaling process. So PAR advocated very heavily with the legislature in Pennsylvania to pass some reforms to wholesaling legislation. They were successful at doing so. And this past July 8th of 2024, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro signed into law what is called Act 52. So Peter, what is Act 52 and how does it impact the wholesale industry?
Yeah, great question. So this act, just so everyone's aware, will become effective beginning of January. So beginning of 2025. It was 180 days after the date of signature. What this act does, and I think the main thing to kind of underscore here, it amends the Real Estate Licensing and Registration Act, which is the act that governs all of licensees and brokers here in Pennsylvania, how they can interact and what they're lawfully allowed to do with their business. So what it does effectively, now keep in mind this applies in our typical transactions to residential properties. What is residential property? We fall back to our seller's disclosure definition, 1 to 4 residential units. So again, wholesaling theoretically for 6 7-8 unit property may not fall under this context. However, we're talking about those residential properties. What the law does, it imposes some disclosures that need to be not just made to the client, to the seller in this instance, but or to the buyer, but also disclosures that need to be in the contract. So there's certain things such as a 30-day time period after the signature of the wholesaling agreement that the buyer or the seller in this instance can say, I no longer want to move forward. I want a refund of all my money and I want to terminate this transaction. Likewise, for a buyer who enters into that transaction not understanding, oh wait, I'm buying from an equitable interest holder, not the legal title holder, they would have the same right to get out of that transaction within 30 days from signature. Teaching point there is if you're a wholesaler and your plan is to, hey, I'll sign this wholesaling agreement and I'm going to go in and start doing a whole bunch of work. I'm going to pay off delinquent taxes. I'm going to pay off a delinquent mortgage. You better wait 30 days before that happens, because if not, that person with whom you entered the contract could terminate within the 30 days, get back all of the money, and you won't get back anything from that endeavor. So there's a 30-day time period that has to be disclosed. There's also the ability for that consumer to consult with other real estate professionals, attorneys, appraisers, licensees, someone else who would be able to advise them, this is what wholesaling is, and this is what you're in for, okay? Within 10 days of cancellation of the contract, that consumer must receive all money that they've paid back from that licensee. And more importantly, any prizes or gifts that consumer might have won by signing the wholesale agreement or anything else remain the property of that consumer. So really, it's meant to benefit the consumer, to give them a little bit of time period to say, wait, this isn't the normal buy and sell transaction, so let me make sure I actually understand what's going on. The teaching point, though, if it doesn't have that language in there after January, the agreement is voidable at the discretion of the buyer or the seller in this instance up until closing. So again, you have a lot of things to keep in mind, that you could have invested a lot of money to improve it, spent some money at the outset, and now that consumer says, I no longer want to move forward, you didn't have these disclosures, now you're kind of stuck with that. So those were really the changes to the law, is to make this a prominent display on a wholesaling contract. So there is no chance that I as a consumer don't know that this is how that process will play out.
All right. So then here is my question. I want to clarify this. Does someone who wants to practice wholesaling, do they need to get a separate license, or does the standard real estate license or broker's license work?
So that's a great question. This comes back to that amendment to RELRA and the Real Estate Licensing and Registration Act. What they did was define wholesaling or a broker or licensee as someone who engages in wholesaling. So what that means is there is no wholesaling license, there's no wholesaling sub-license or category. In order to engage in wholesaling, you have to have licensure either as a broker or a licensee in order to engage in that practice. And that's based on the definition change. So without that, you could run into some real issues.
Okay. So how does that impact someone who's practicing wholesaling right now but doesn't have a real estate license?
So as of January, okay, the ramification here that you'd be violating the Real Estate Licensing and Registration Act. So effectively, you would be practicing real estate as a licensee without a license. So you would be subject to all of the enforcement that follows through RELRA, through the State Real Estate Commission and the like. So,
all right. So can I, as a wholesaler, establish a corporate entity to do wholesaling? And then if so, who in my corporate entity needs to be licensed in real estate?
Good question. And honestly, it hopefully is not too difficult of an answer. It's identical to any type of brokerage that would have that corporate entity, because you're the same as a wholesaler as you are a broker or licensee. Typically, anybody with a controlling interest, meaning you can vote, you can decide on the outcome of any business decision, would need to have licensure. The safest thing is everybody who's going to be a member of that company should have licensure. And if not, make sure you're consulting with legal counsel and your broker, obviously, because they're going to be the ones who have to approve that corporate structure and that entity, and make sure you're confirming that any type of silent partner who may not have licensure truly has no operational control of that entity, because that's where you can really run into some issues.
Got it. So what advice would you give to brokers of record who are, considering having licensees in their office who want to practice wholesaling?
The reality is, with the amendment to RELRA, this is now deemed to be an acceptable means of practicing real estate for a broker or licensee, as long as you have those designations or those licensures. So I think it's kind of one of two approaches to your business model. You could say the old ostrich, we'll put our head in the sand, we're going to ignore this and not try to deal with it and prohibit any of our agents from doing that. I think the more realistic approach is, this is a business model that's been recognized. Becoming familiar with the requirements is going to be imperative imperative. We were just having a discussion that as of now, there is no standard agreement through the Pennsylvania Association of Realtors that addresses a wholesaling contract. So all of those mandatory provisions I talked about are going to have to be put into that contract by legal counsel, or hopefully, by a broker or someone that is overseeing that transaction.
Right.
So for the broker side, get familiar with the law, start asking questions, call those who are competent in this area. I always say, and that's kind of my closing remarks I'll come back to, don't believe everything you read on the internet or see on TV, but make those phone calls to those who have the knowledge to make sure you're compliant, because if not, again, you could invest a lot of time and effort, your agents a lot of time and effort. Not only could they be practicing in violation of RELRA, but it could be avoidable contract by the buyer. So.
And also a safe bet that brokers of record should contact their E&O insurance to see if wholesaling will be covered?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So how do you think these changes will impact the larger real estate market in Pennsylvania?
Up until this point, this has kind of been a very unregulated area of real estate. And having been involved in various ethics hearings, wholesaling does play a part in some of those that we've had. And really, it was the lack of transparency, the lack of oversight of really anybody who could do this on a website effectively without having licensure, without having to follow any type of code of ethics, without any state regulation from the real estate commission. So I think how this is going to impact things is, will it make life a little bit harder for those who are trying to operate out of the law potentially? But is that the intent? Yes. So I think it's just going to be a matter of getting through the growing pains with the brokers to realize that this is an acceptable business model as long as it's done correctly. So that will be the real change. But I truly see that the transparency element will have the biggest impact, because the consumers are going to know now this is how that transaction will play out. I should say, hopefully now, knock on wood. If transactions are done correctly, they will know what they're getting into. So.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Peter, for sharing your insights on this very important topic. Anything else we missed covering that you wanted to share with everybody?
I've already said it, but like I said before, don't believe everything that you read on the internet. There are a lot of articles out there. Wholesaling, like I said, was very unregulated in Pennsylvania, so there's still some older articles out there. So if you're looking into this, pick up the phone and call the professionals. Most importantly, speak with your broker, because they're going to be your best tool of information and resources to say, I don't know the answer to that question, but let's pick up the phone and call Peter or call Shauna, and we'll get the answers to those questions. So again, just kind of trust your instincts, and if something doesn't smell right, it probably isn't.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I hope that information was helpful to you. If there's ever any topics or questions you want us to address, please feel free to reach out to me, because my doors and ears are always open to you. Thanks so much, and have a wonderful day.